Happy Sabbath, everybody. I want to welcome each of you to our fourth study together. Let's open with a word of prayer. Holy God, as we look around the world, as we look at ourselves, we see that there is a fundamental difference regarding what's happening today compared to even the recent past. The world seems to have changed, and so have we. And yet, there are very few changes. Everything seems to carry on as it's always been. Help us to navigate a safe path trying to discern the changes and the consistency. Be with us in this study, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. In our previous presentations, we have spoken about the secrets of our success. You remember it's an Ellen White phrase that we used. And we just looked at four elements. We looked at methodology. We looked at the importance of coming together. We looked at the issue of organization. And we discussed financial aspects of God's church. And these four elements can easily be found in inspiration. And the way Ellen White speaks of them, it's that they are critical in order for the church or the movement to succeed. We remind us that there's an opportunity to ask questions tomorrow. Please submit those questions. Whether you go to the book of Daniel or the book of Revelation, you can even go into Old Testament books and New Testament books. And you'll see a subject that's discussed over and over again. It's the relationship between church and state. So I want to spend some time in this study discussing this subject. As you all know, this issue of church and state, the relationship between the two, the tension between the two, has been a theme of Bible prophecy that existed long before Adventism. So this is not just a phenomena of Revelation 13. You should all have an understanding, I hope, the tension between church and state when we go back 2,000 years. When you go to the nation of, or the kingdom of Israel. We say Israel, but by the time we've got to the dispensation or the history of Christ, which is the history of the seventh and the first church, you see that there's a tension between church and state in that history. Through divine acts, through providence, what happens in that history? Does anybody have a thought? In the history of Laodicea, Ephesus, the dispensation or the history of Christ and his disciples, what happens to church and state? Nobody is sure? Okay. I'll give my thoughts. Oh, are you saying something? We'll just get the mic if you are. Does everybody understand my question? Put your hands up if you don't understand what I'm asking.
Merci. Alors, si je comprends bien, j'essaie de comprendre, hein, quand tu parles de l'Église et de l'État au temps de Jésus, est-ce
So
que
I
tu
try to understand. So if I understand well, you talk about church and state at the time period of Christ.
est-ce que c'est au moment de la crucifixion de Jésus, voilà,
Or
dans quel contexte?
Is it at the time of the death of Christ, crucifixion? In which context?
Not just that specific event in 31, that dispensation. In its broadest sense, you'd begin at 4 BC and go to 100 AD. But we can think of that history as a singular point in Earth's history, and there's a change that happens.
Je sais que lors de la naissance de Jésus, si on peut dire, il y a eu l'État qui s'est mélangé à, si on peut dire, à la religion.
So I know that at the birth of Christ, state and church was united.
Puisqu'on a vu depuis la naissance de Jésus, il y avait une histoire de roi.
So at the birth of Christ, there is a king.
Il ne voulait pas d'autre roi que César. Je sais ça.
And after they said no other king than Caesar.
So, before that dispensation, church and state are combined. This is in Israel. And Afterwards, church and state are separate. So there's a fracturing of that relationship. Depending upon the story that you're telling, you would give a different date for that separation. Corinne?
Les dirigeants juifs ont utilisé l'Empire romain pour crucifier Christ.
So the Jewish leadership used the Roman Empire to crucify Christ.
Sure. And why did you say that? What point were you making?
Je vois la tension entre l'Église et l'État.
I saw the tension between state and church.
Okay, so we're all clear that when I say church and state, this is the state of Israel and the church of Israel, yes?
When I say church, quand je dis Église et l'État, on comprend bien qu'on parle de l'Église d'Israël et de l'État d'Israël.
Yes? Okay. I did ask everybody, and everybody said, yeah, they understood the question.
J'ai demandé, vous avez dit que vous avez compris la question.
Okay, so we're all on the same page now.
Donc nous sommes tous sur la même longueur d'onde.
We say Israel,
Nous disons Israël,
but this is only the two tribes, remember?
mais rappelez-vous, il s'agit des deux tribus.
So this is the story of Israel.
Il s'agit là de l'histoire d'Israël.
Why does that separation happen?
Après cette séparation a-t-elle lieu? Robert,
Avant la captivité de Babylone,
before, go on.
avant la captivité de Babylone, l'Église et l'État d'Israël étaient combinés.
So
Et
before Israel captivity to Babylon, church and state, Israel church and state was combined.
Après, quand ils sont revenus de la captivité,
And after the captivity,
l'État d'Israël a perdu son autorité par rapport au royaume dominant, Babylone, les Mèdes et les Perses et la Grèce.
well, after the captivity, après la captivité de Babylone,
L'État a perdu son autorité civile
alors after the captivity, the state of Israel lost its civil authority
par rapport aux nations dominantes comme les Mèdes et les Perses, les Grecs, les Romains.
because of the nations that govern, so Rome, Medo-Perse, and Babylon, etc.
Donc, au temps des Romains, les Romains laissaient une petite autorité à l'État d'Israël pour gérer des choses superflues.
So at the time period of Roman Empire, so Israel has a little bit of power on the civil.
Donc, au temps de Jésus, l'État d'Israël avait une petite armée, mais c'était dans l'Église.
So in time period of Jesus, Israel state has a little army, but it was inside the church.
So you've given a history, but my question was, why is there a fracturing of the two in this dispensation?
Ma question portait sur la raison pour laquelle il y a une séparation et une fracture dans cette dispensation.
Anybody can answer that. I'm not.
Quelqu'un d'autre, n'importe qui peut répondre. Is it because we will there will be a transition?
You said there's a transition between.
Two church, Laodicéen à Éphèse, il y a une transition entre deux églises. Je ne-
If anybody doesn't understand something, please ask me instead of asking between yourselves. It's probably easier, I think.
Alors, si quelqu'un ne comprend pas ce que je dis, il est préférable de me poser la question que de la poser à votre voisin voisine.
Because if you're not sure of something, then someone else might not be, and I can answer.
Parce que si vous n'êtes pas sûr de quelque chose, eh bien, quelqu'un d'autre pourrait répondre.
I didn't understand what you said, Shemaine. Never mind? Okay.
Alors, quand je vois la fracture entre Israël et l'État, je pense qu'en ce temps-là, je crois qu'Hélène White explique bien qu'il y a, comment dirais-je, le peuple d'Israël était soumis à l'État.
So the reason of this separation is because Ellen White said Israel was under submission to the state.
Ils a-
1 second. Israel was under submission to the state. So, who's Israel and who's the state?
Alors, le peuple juif.
So Jewish people,
Jewish people is what? Israel?
Oui, le peuple d'Israël. Oui, juif.
And the state is?
Et l'État. Et l'État, c'était les Romains, si on peut dire.
Rome,
Si je ne me trompe pas, Rome.
if I'm not mistaken.
Sorry, you're mistaken. Because I've said this is about Israel only. Nothing to do with Rome.
D'accord. Ok.
Yeah.
J'essaie de comprendre ta question, mais j'ai...
Okay.
So I try to understand
Yes.
your question.
Okay, I'm going to take a step back because maybe I've assumed too much. Give me 1 second. So Ellen White's going to use a term called the Jewish economy. Hopefully you've heard of that term. It's not about economics. So when she speaks about the Jewish economy, is anybody familiar with that term? Some not. So let me read a quote, a sentence from her. Just seeing where I would begin. So this is talking about God. In God's mercy, He did not blot out all the nations or the kingdoms of this world. The world, humanity, according to Romans chapter 1, did not worship God, did not acknowledge God, but instead they created false gods or images. Paul says they did that in their vain imaginations. But in God's mercy, He didn't destroy humanity. God had a different plan. God purposed to give human beings another chance, an opportunity to know God. And the way God was going to do that was how? How is God going to go to all the world and say, you need to know who I am? Instead of doing things in your vain imaginations.
Oui, je ne sais pas si j'ai bien compris.
I don't know if I understood you well.
Je dis que c'est à travers, disons, la rébellion du peuple de Dieu.
La rébellion, t'as dit?
Oui,
So, because of God's people rebellion,
et que Dieu a fait, disons, le monde reconnaître qu'il est Dieu. Il a livré le peuple d'Israël, disons, en captivité.
so God, because of Israelite rebellion, God allowed them to be in captivity.
So this is not about Israel. I try to say that this is about human beings. The kingdoms of this world. They rejected God. I've sent you the quote. They rejected God. They began to have false God. That's Romans 1, 21. We should hopefully all be familiar with the first part of Romans chapter 1. Who is God talking about in the first part of Romans 1? I'll give you a multiple choice. Jews or Gentiles? Gentiles. Okay, so this is not about Israel. The Gentiles have lost their connection with God. But I don't want to call them Gentiles, I want to call them people. Humans. Now they did that deliberately. Where do you see that story? The Tower of Babel. They've come through the flood and they create a system where they're going to question or reject God. And that's what the Tower of Babel is a representation of. Are we okay with that? So, God has two choices. We can do the flood again and kill everybody, or we can do Tower of Babel again and scatter everybody, or both of those are the same option. Or there's a second option. And that's what we were reading. What's the second option? You either punish people or you educate them. In God's mercy, God did not blot them out. Who is the them? Shout out, we said a minute ago. Who is the them? The Gentiles. Good. Okay, so in God's mercy, He won't destroy the Gentiles. but he's going to give them an opportunity to know God. And what is that opportunity that he gives them? How will they learn about God? Someone said something here? Not Jesus. Israel. So God is going to create Israel and present Israel to the world. And through Israel, they will learn who God is. God purposed to give the Gentiles an opportunity of learning about God through God's chosen people. We okay with that? Through the teachings of the sacrificial service. So, of course, if it's a sacrificial service, that's about Christ. So the plan was, long before this event, before Christ is going to come, what do the Gentiles need to see? Who do they need to see? Before the real Christ comes, they need to see who or what? Christ. They need to see Christ before Christ is actually even going to come. How would they do that? Not prophecy. Through the sacrificial system. The lamb that gets sacrificed for the sins of the world. And Israel are supposed to be the teachers. It's like going to a museum. You come to the center, you look at everything that's happening, and the guides educate you about what those things mean. So then Christ is known to the Gentiles. Then when he was going to come, they would all be ready. Are we okay with that? You know the story of the Magi. Why are the Magi sent to Jerusalem? Who wants to speak? Betsy? Betsy?
En fait, les mages avaient étudié la prophétie et ils avaient vu qu'il y aurait eu un Messie qui devait venir.
So the Magi, they study prophecy and they realize that the Messiah was about to come.
Yes. Why are they doing that? Who should be doing it? Will let Betsy answer?
Oui, Israël.
Yes. So Israel should be doing that. They fail. So God sends the Gentiles to do that. In fact, they're sent to Israel. So you see example after example where this system that God set up isn't working. Christ was the foundation of the Jewish economy. The whole system, as you said, was a compact or condensed prophecy. That's a sacrificial system. It's a symbol of prophecy. Okay, so if we're okay with that, before Christ, the church and the state of Israel are combined. And as Robert explained, they're going to interact or engage with the world. The only way you can do that, the only way you can speak to Egypt is through an ambassador. Is an ambassador church or state? State. State, not church. State. So, if you want to interact or influence the world, the Gentiles, you need a state to do that. That's why you have church and state. After Christ, that church-state relationship is broken. There's a separation of church and state. And now, if we use the same word, Israel, what is Israel now? Post-Christ, after Christ. I'll give you three options. Church, state, or church and state. Church, state, or church and state. Just tell me the number. Who said three? Who said two? No one. Who said one? Okay. Okay. So the answer is one. Israel is now just a church. It's broken. In AD 70, the temple, which is a symbol of the state, I know it's a religious building, but everything connected with it, it's the center of organization. It's destroyed. And the church is now left on its own. And it's scattered. And now, the state that looks after the church is Rome. Caesar becomes the guardian of the church, not the Sanhedrin.
Oui, j'allais faire une remarque, mais il vient de donner la réponse.
Okay, I was going to do a remark, but you just gave the answer.
Please do the remark.
Parce que j'ai dit numéro 3,
I said number 3
parce que je pensais qu'on se référait à cette époque dans laquelle nous vivons.
because I think that we were talking about our time period in which we're living.
Good. So, if we all are okay up to this point now, The question is why? Why break up a good marriage? Why fracture this relationship? What God has put together, let no one break apart. That's exactly what happens. The church and the state divorce. Who does that? Let's ask that question. Who? Put your hands up. God. Okay, so we'll say who? God. God does the breakup. Why? Why does God make them separate?
Je ne sais pas si c'est la réponse, mais quand je réfléchis,
I don't know if it is the answer, but when I'm thinking,
je me dis que c'était la meilleure façon pour que son peuple puisse de nouveau le connaître.
I think it was the best way in order these people can know God
Pour le
again,
rééduquer,
to re-educate the people,
parce qu'ils ont échoué dans leur mission.
because they fail in their mission.
Who are the people that need to be educated? Israel or the world?
Alors là, on va dire Israël d'abord et ensuite le monde.
So first Israel, second the world.
Okay, anyone else? The purpose of Israel, Ellen White will call them God's chosen people. What was the purpose of its creation? Was it created to be a state or created to be a church? The primary purpose. Put your hands up if it's state. Put your hands up if it's church. Okay, so most people agree that the purpose was to create a church. I'm suggesting, in order for that church to become successful, to do its job, it needs to have properties or characteristics of a state. Think of Solomon. Everybody knows that Solomon is prosperous. State. Rich with money. They go to Solomon, find out why. And when he has them in his grasp, when he has them captive, what was he supposed to do? Lift up Christ, because I didn't get that translated. Lift up Christ through the sacrificial system. Instead, he said, yeah, I'm a good trader. I understand about the stock market. I'm just really clever. So we know that story. So the purpose of having God's people was to have a church. That's the apple in God's eye. In order for it to function and do its job, it needs to also be connected to a state. So that relationship between the church and the state of Israel becomes corrupted. The church uses the state, and the state uses the church. We're okay with that? And so the reason why God's going to separate them is because of corruption. Are we okay with that? So the church has been corrupted because of power, because of state power. And the state is no longer doing its job. In order to fix the problem, God will separate them. And now it's far safer, better for the church to be under the protection of pagan Rome. Are we okay with that story? Any questions? Muriel? Oh, Muriel?
Je comprends ce que tu dis,
I understand what you said,
mais est-ce qu'on peut dire que cette séparation a réellement lieu
but is it possible that we say that this separation is happened
à la création de l'église d'Éphèse?
at the creation of the Ephesus, at the church Ephesus?
Could you just do the question again? I don't know if the question is bad or the translation. I didn't understand what the point was. Sorry.
Parce que je n'arrive pas à bien comprendre à quel moment a lieu cette séparation Église-État pour Israël.
My problem is I don't really understand when this separation, church and state, is happened for Israel. So that's why she asks you, can we place the starting point, the beginning, at the creation of Ephesus?
Juste après la mort de Christ.
Is it just after Christ dead?
Yes.
OK.
So we could mark 34, 66, 70. So it's in the history of Ephesus. It's when Rome comes and destroys the nation of Israel. It's no longer a vassal state. It's a scattered nation. And after that, you begin to see that many people ravage that country. Okay? So we've spoken about corruption. If you jump to Revelation 13, you see a lamb rising up out of the earth. Having two horns. And most of us have some understanding of what all that symbology means. What does Ellen White say that those horns represent? What does Ellen White say the horns on the lamb represent? So the two horns represent church and state, someone has said. And what does that mean?
Alors peut-être une réconciliation.
Maybe a reconciliation.
Joining together.
Ensemble.
Ensemble.
I don't know what ensemble means.
Join together, so I just repeat, translate.
Okay. Sorry. So this land that rises up, we want church and state to come together. So that would mean the only people that could become the president of the United States is someone who has the religion of the United States. Is that what we think that lamb symbol represents? Clara, unless you want, it's difficult. Some people think it's difficult. Some people say easy. Over here, they said it's easy over here.
Je vais dire tout le système économique, militaire ou autre.
So I will say all the economic system, military and other.
Any more? No. Okay, I want to go. Paulette.
Alors, on a un seul animal qui a les deux cornes. Donc, on pourrait penser qu'ils se sont réconciliés.
So we have one animal that have two horns, so we can think that they reconcile.
Mais en même temps, il y a deux cornes, pas une seule.
But at the same time, there are two horns, not one.
C'est pour cela que je disais que c'était difficile, en fait, de vraiment dire s'ils sont réconciliés ou toujours séparés.
So that's why I said it was difficult to say if they reconcile or has been separate.
Surtout par rapport à ce que l'on voit aujourd'hui.
Because of what we see today.
Avec J.D. Vance.
With J.D. Vance.
So I found it quite interesting. Oh, someone? Oh. Yeah?
Alors, je trouve très intéressant ce sujet parce que je me suis toujours posé la question.
I think this topic really interesting. I always ask me this question.
À quoi ressemble le royaume de Dieu?
What looks like God's kingdoms?
Est-ce que l'Église et l'État sont séparés?
Church and state, are they separate?
Si les États-Unis représentent le pays glorieux,
If United States represents the glorious land,
la terre d'asile,
the land who protect and receive people,
Dieu devrait avoir donné le symbole de l'union à nouveau de l'Église et de l'État.
God should have give again the symbol of church and state.
Peut-être que dans un premier temps,
Maybe, firstly,
ils devraient être séparés,
they should be separate,
mais je pense que le but, c'était de nouveau les réunir.
but I think that the target was to bring them together again.
So when you ask Adventists about this subject, these symbols, Revelation 13, this beast, most people will say the following. The horns represent church and state, and more than that, the separation of those two. Yes. And they think that's what Ellen White says. But she never speaks of it in that way. She infers some things, suggests. So, give you a reference, Great Controversy, 441. Yes. And the previous reference was Acts of the Apostles, 14.1. Yeah, I just did it for the video. So, when I asked what those horns represented, people said church and state. But I think I heard Clara say republicanism and Protestantism. Because I asked what Ellen White said. So this is what Ellen White's going to say that the horns represent. The lamb-like horns the horns of the lamb indicate youth, innocence, and gentleness. She says that's what these horns represent. Doesn't talk about church and state, doesn't talk about separation. And based upon that, when you go to like an Adventist preacher, they just say, it's United States, church and state, separate. But in this quote, and there aren't that many quotes, Ellen White doesn't express it that way. She does go in this passage to explain the characteristics of America. I can't see that. If it's timing, I've got 20. I've got 22 minutes. Yeah. Thank you. So she's then going to go in this passage to explain the United States. And this is where we get the separation of church and state. This concept, this idea. Because she speaks of two documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And in the independence document, we all know the phrase. Everybody is created equal, and we have a right for life, liberty, and happiness. In the English, it says property. So it says that in the Declaration of Independence. Everyone's equal, and everyone has the right to have life, freedom, and property. So that's what that says. Then the Constitution says what? A government that's created by the people, to serve the people, and that government can only come from the people. So it's the people that create that government. The government is supposed to serve the people, and you can only be a member of the government if you're an American. That's the essence of those two documents. And why did they create those documents? Because what had happened, if we do another dispensation, and we'll call this the time of the end, 1798, if we were to do 5 and 6, in this history before, you have church and state. Who's the church? Papacy. Who's the state? We'll call it the European kings. If we could do that. Yeah? And they had learnt of what happens when you have that system. So when they go to the New World, because this was the old world, they say, we're going to fracture that relationship. So that's why they create these documents. And then they say, the inevitable conclusion of those documents is freedom of religious belief. Every person can worship God as they wish. So republicanism, we know it's a form of government. And then you have Protestantism. We have to be careful when we talk about Protestantism, because I think we have these wrong assumptions of what that actually means. What is republicanism? I know it's government, don't say that. When they say republicanism, what do they mean?
Je crois que dans ce contexte, le républicanisme doit être mis en opposition avec la monarchie.
So I think in that context, republicanism should be put in contradiction with or in opposition with the monarchy.
Good. So we'll say it's a government by the people, of the people, and from the people. Simply put. And what's Protestantism? Because most people are going to say Christianity. And I'm going to suggest it's not. The right to protest, someone said. More? Paula said more? Paula, no?
Alors je m'explique parce qu'ils viennent de l'Europe où ils ont subi la répression au
So
travers du
she's talking
catholicisme.
about Protestantism, the religion, because they are coming from Europe where they was oppressed.
Et là, ils protestent en fait contre toute forme d'oppression.
And then they're protesting against any form of oppression.
De religion.
Of religion.
So, Protestantism, I want to suggest, is not Christianity. We'll say this. It's freedom to worship God. We'll just say to worship. We'll say to live according to one's conscience or choice. So we can say, is that okay? Exactly, I'm writing what she said. That's what I'm doing. I agreed with her. Yes, because what she said wasn't just about the papacy specifically, and it's not about Christianity. Because when we talk Protestantism, we think sola scriptura. And I want to suggest the way it's being used here, it doesn't mean that. It's not the Reformation version of protesting the papacy. It's protesting control of someone's conscience. Because if you have them together in the way that we've had in the past, old Europe, Israel, what happens is the only people who can get into government are the people who have the right religion, the right belief. And what this symbology is teaching in Revelation 13, what America was founded on, is a special form of government which was against the monarchy. Someone said about monarchy. And everybody can live how they want. believe what they want. So that's how I want to reframe, particularly Protestantism, in that way. So if we're okay with that, then this movement, from its inception, time of the end, 1989, when we looked at prophecy, looking forward, how do you do that? You're here at the time of the end, and you want to look forward. How do you do that? Tell me the mechanism or give me the Bible chapter. Shemaine? Isaiah 46. And you gave us the verse 10. So, the way you look forward is by looking back. I'm the God that predicts the future from the past. So you have to look forward and back. So that's an old study that we used to do, and it's still correct. But it causes a problem. Because in Revelation 17 and 13, speaks about resurrection. And in recent studies, we have, if not defined, we have explained resurrection. The difference between resurrection and birth is that when you resurrect, you were alive before, you died, and you're born again. Baptism, the resurrection of Christ. And the important thing to remember, and we consistently forget, when you resurrect, there's one important element. You look different. If you go to Christ, you look better. And that's what you're all hoping for. In the resurrection, aren't you? A nicer looking body. So, if we're okay with that, when we go to this history, we have to be careful what we are looking for in the future, what we're anticipating. We know there's a Sunday law coming. How do you know? Because there's one in the past. Good, so you got that. Because there was one there. What was in the past? Clues here, the clues here. What was in the past? Church and state. What we expect in the future? Church and state. And this is the problem or the ditch in which this movement has entered into or fallen into. This idea of church and state after 1989. Because when you use words, they mean something or they infer something. That's why I wanted to question what Protestantism is. And I want to reframe it, not redefine it. And that's what those words say. So if you can just read those words, Shemaine, for them. From here. Paraphrase it so the people understand what that says. It's not sola scriptura or the Bible. This is the problem that Christians had back in 1798 history, and the same problem they're having now, and the same problem we contend to have. It's not about the Bible and it's not about Christianity. If that's correct, then when Ellen White talks about Protestant America, what does Protestant America mean? Let's use different words. What's America? We've already used the words. Not that word. Not that word. Republicanism and Protestantism or Protestant America is not some Christian thing. It means freedom of choice. We'll use the word liberty. I prefer that one. Yes, so I'm just going to use liberty. I like that. So Protestant America means having liberty. And how do you have that liberty? This state guarantees it. So I want us to see Protestant America in a slightly different way than you may have thought about before. A phrase that we have borrowed, that's good. If that's good, what's the bad phrase that we use? What do we put here? If that's good, we agree that's good. What's the bad version of that? What word do we stick in front of Protestantism? Apostate Protestantism is not some false version of the Bible. What is it? If the good is liberty, what's the apostate? Okay, we'll say control. So, what I want us to begin to see, to reframe our thinking, when we use these terms, Protestant America, apostate Protestantism, church and state, republicanism, Protestantism, all of these terms, I understand that it's church and state at a very simple, basic level. I know Protestantism is a Christian denomination, but I want us to see it in a slightly different way. We taught church and state for a very long time. And when we spoke about church, we meant Christians, like Catholics, Protestants. And we then went into the threefold union, spiritualism, Protestantism, Catholicism. Had all these really strictly defined definitions of religion. And I think, I'm sure, we've made mistakes in doing that. So several years ago, Elder Tess stood up and she said, "Stop this church thing that you talk about, because it's not fit for purpose." So we were saying church. We'll call it religion. I want us to see that the way we've expressed it here, there's no religious aspect to it. Then Elder Tess said, not church. What word did she use? Culture. So she tried to reframe our thinking by using the word culture. That was her attempt in trying to reframe our thinking when we start thinking about Protestant America, apostate Protestantism, or republicanism and Protestantism as Ellen White uses it. So I want us to see that if you look carefully at these terms, GC 441, you can see that Ellen White wasn't talking about religion or church in the way that we think. She uses the term Protestantism differently. And how do you know? Because you go to the paragraph and you see she's using a technique which we call repeat and enlarge. She sets a narrative in the first part of the paragraph and repeats it in the second part. So I want us to see simply that Elder Tess was trying to guide us. away from a model that isn't helpful. I don't want to call it wrong, but it's not fit for purpose. So that's the word that she used. And now, as time has moved on, rapidly, it's only been a few years, now there's an exploration to use even a different word. Not church, not culture, but nationalism. What I want us to see is that these are not inventions by these elders. These are not some new radical thoughts. All they're doing is reframing our incorrect understanding of this element that we call church, which, if you go back to the origins of where all of this came from, we've just went to Revelation 13. If you re-look, you can see them there in the original words. In the original idea, it wasn't this Christian religion that was being referred to. And it's very difficult to look at Ellen White's writings. In English, they use the word parsing, which means carefully checking. Because Ellen White lives in a time in America that is anti-Catholic. And it molds and shapes the way she writes. So as time goes on, you're going to see us increasingly understand why we've gone from church to culture to nationalism. They all mean the same thing, but when you say the words, they infer very different things. They shape how you view things. That's why it's important to use the right word in the right context. Let's pray. Holy God, we thank you that we can see that you who began this work have continued to raise up people to finish this work. Help each of us to go back to the time of the End magazine, to earlier studies, to the Bible, to Ellen White's writings, and search for these things to see if they are so. Give us objective hearts and minds, and help us to love the truth above all things, because that's how we are set free. In Jesus' name, amen.